I'm very excited to welcome you to the new session of Paula's Studiolo. And Caroline, it is such an honor to have you in Studiolo with us.
Well, I'm delighted to be here with you, Paula, and everyone. Greetings, everyone. I'm joining from Dublin, Ireland, where it's 6 o'clock in the evening and it's really cold and wet and miserable.
Caroline, you have made such an incredible mark in our field of art history. You're directing one of the most incredible museums, National Gallery of Ireland. You're writing incredible books. Now you have this show that everyone should see. And I wanted to start our conversation with just asking you how did you start studying art history?
Well, I didn't know there was such a subject as art history when I was at school. And when I discovered it, my teachers told me that it wasn't something that I could study, partly because they said it was only for people, and this was totally wrong. They said it was for people from the elite, and a girl from a grammar school in Belfast wasn't going to have any success in studying this subject. But they said this not because they felt it was something I shouldn't do, but because they were worried I would have no career if I started it. But my mother took me to look at art from a young age. And in fact, the museum that I'm very honoured now to run, the National Gallery of Ireland, was the first art gallery I visited outside my home city. And she took me to look at her favourite pictures. She very sensibly combined it with some cake and some tea and a trip to the shops. I had such a wonderful day that I was totally hooked, and I've never looked back really in that sense in my love of art.
Incredible. And now your exhibition at the Met will probably be something that young people who are lucky enough to see it in New York, hopefully with their own parents, will be something that they will take with them. I mean, that is just what a privilege. And how about that teacher? Did you ever go to say hello to her again and kind of show her your books and tell
And
her what
I,
you're
I
doing
kept
now?
I kept in touch with him for many years. Sadly, he died a couple of years ago. He was a completely brilliant history teacher, but he just he didn't have much interest in images himself. And he was actually, I'm afraid he cried when I got a place at the Courtauld and told him that I was going, not out of joy, but because he was so upset that not just me, but his and other people he very much loved. And we will have very much, helped. We both actually ended up at the Courtauld Institute, and she's now director of collections at the Royal Academy in London. So neither of us have had bad careers, but it was certainly not something which we were encouraged to study in Northern Ireland in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But, I'm very glad I did. I'm very pleased I ended up being an art historian.
And you know, Caroline, I think this also kind of shows us how times have changed. And the exhibition that is now happening at the Met probably couldn't happen 20 or 30 years ago. These very fragile panels would have probably never been given on the loan back then. So I feel your career, all that you have accomplished, or you're doing now in the field, is really kind of showing that change, that anyone from any culture, any background can actually make a very valuable contribution to the field.
Well, I think that, art is really extraordinary because it is something that we can all look at, we can all engage with, we all can shape our knowledge of it just by looking. It's really an incredibly open discipline. Obviously, there's a lot to read and to think about, but we all can do it by looking and enjoying art ourselves. And for this particular project, I've been really privileged to work as part of an extraordinary team of art historians and curators. This exhibition is curated by many people, by Stefan Wollahogen at the Met, myself, Professor Joanna Cannon, one of the leading scholars of Sienese art at the Courtauld Institute in London, and some younger scholars as well too. Laura Llewellyn at the National Gallery in London and Imogen Tedbury, and also with the participation of some other brilliant younger scholars as well. So it's been a really great bringing together of people across generations and across countries actually to look at Sienese art in the early 14th century.
And you know, as someone who studied Florentine art, and for me, everything starts with Cimabue and Giotto, to have this switch that you brilliantly did to actually show how radical these artists who are living in Siena in this very specific time in history, and how none of them will actually survive the Black Plague of 1348. I really cannot
No.
wait for you to take us through the exhibition. Not everyone will have the honor to be able to see it in person. So this is actually the second best thing.
Well, I'm thrilled to do it. And I hope that those of you who have seen it in New York will go back afresh. Those of you who have the opportunity to see it in London and New York will really enjoy it too. And of course, we can all see many of these objects, usually in their home museums and particularly in Siena. And this is not an exhibition that is, saying that Sienese art is better than Florentine art, but it is thinking very much about the extraordinary importance of these two Tuscan cities for the development of art and the really sort of indelible mark that they both have made on the story of art history in different and many complementary ways. And in fact, many Florentine institutions collected Sienese art from a very, very early point, actually, from the early 14th century onwards, if not before.
Yeah, yes. I would say we can dive right in, and then maybe at the end, if you have time to just stay for a few
Wonderful.
questions, that would be great.
Fantastic. That's wonderful. Well, I'm going to try and share my screen and look forward to doing this now. I hope you can see my presentation. Wonderful.
Yes.
Well, today the conversation that we're going to have is about the rise of painting, but it's also about the city of Siena. And the place of Siena is something which is very difficult to show in the exhibition. And that's because Siena is so particular, but these art objects have gone all around the world. I'm just showing you on the screen now a view of the National Gallery of Ireland, a museum that I hope you have the chance to visit if you haven't already. This gallery, which was established in 1854, has, like many galleries across the world, great works of Sienese art. I'm showing you a panel by Ugolino di Verio and a panel by probably a French artist, but working very much in the Sienese style from the early 14th, early 15th century, just to show you how wide the geography of the art of Siena, of the paintings has become, and how very, very far they have been dispersed. And this exhibition is a project that I've worked on for many, many years with the group of scholars I mentioned a few minutes ago. But it also interestingly coincides with an interest of mine, which has been long going, about cities and about the experience of cities and how that feeds into the production and making of art. And last year I published my first non-exhibition related book, which is a very general book, a book intended, I think, to appeal to those people like myself 30 years ago, who didn't really have any knowledge of art history, something which takes you in from the experience of living and thinking and visiting cities into the art that's produced in them. And Siena is not one of the cities treated in my book, which has just come out in paperback. If there's a second edition, I think it certainly will be. But I had such difficulty choosing the cities I wanted to talk about in this book. But Siena is a place in terms of its art that is very much shaped by its geography. And here's just an image that I took a month ago when I was last in Siena, standing just below the wonderful church of San Domenico, in fact, just beside the house of St. Catherine of Siena, a saint who doesn't come into this story because she's from the subsequent century, but looking upwards towards the cathedral, the Duomo, and then you will see on the left of the screen the tower of the Palazzo Pubblico and the Campo rising up above the city, because Siena is most strikingly a city of hills, a city that you need quite a lot of endurance to walk around it on a daily basis. And the geography of Siena has very much shaped it. One other thing that has hugely shaped it, I think, of course, is its significance in relation to other cities. We talked about Florence briefly, and that between Siena and Florence has often been one of rivalry. As somebody who comes from Ireland, I can say that the rivalry of Siena and Florence strikes me a little bit of the relationship of Ireland to England, or indeed of the Scots to the English too. A very close relationship, but one that at some points has been complicated and sometimes been difficult. But Siena's importance in a European sense also comes from its position on a very major trade route and also a very significant pilgrimage route. And on the screen, I'm showing you the Via Francigena, which is the pilgrimage route which ran from Canterbury in England, founded by Archbishop Childeric in the late 10th century in about 990, which goes through northern Europe, indeed, and then through the Alps and through Italy to Rome itself. And we know that this was a very important connection for many years for those who visited Siena. And in fact, the experience of visiting Siena as a pilgrim was one which has been described very memorably by the architectural historian Fabrizio Nevola as one of walking through a sort of undulating tunnel of streets. And that's the impact that I've tried to give in this image just here, of the sense that when you're in Siena, you feel you're very much in a tight place, a place that has really its specific identity. Its architectural identity is often in terms of brick and these high buildings that you look up towards. In painting, as we'll see, it's an identity which has been framed around tradition, innovation, and also narrative, and an exposure to the world beyond. And that world beyond is one that also often came through the people who visited Siena on the pilgrimage route. We know also that the art of Siena was widely exported, and that's one of the areas that we look at in this exhibition. And this wasn't just in terms of paintings, but it was in terms of metalwork. We know from accounts of Siena and its architectural and topographical nature in the 14th and 15th century that many of the main metal workers, Siena was a great centre of working in metal and enamel, set their shops up along the place where the pilgrimages came, the undulating tunnel, as I described it, that went through the city. And I'm showing you here on the left of the screen an incredible cross by Tondino Guarino, one of the named Sienese enamel workers from the early years of the 14th century. What's extraordinary about these works, which we see in religious buildings across Italy and indeed across Europe, is the brightness of their colour, something which often becomes lost in paintings. And it's really interesting in the exhibition to be able to look at these juxtapositions between works such as the Tondino Cross, which in the space in New York is not very far from Duccio's extraordinary triptych from the National Gallery in London. Indeed, one of the objects that's never travelled before this exhibition out of its home institution. The bright ultramarine blue of the Virgin's robe is very striking in relation to the blue enamel work in Tondino's cross. And this painting, of course, as well, was also something that travelled. We know that it was commissioned thanks to the work of Dillian Gordon, who was curator at the National Gallery in London for many years and produced an extraordinary catalogue of its early collection in 2011. We know from Gordon's work that this painting, together with one other that's with it in the exhibition, now usually in Boston, were commissioned for a Dominican bishop, the Bishop of Ostia, who's someone who seems to have made his way back and forth between Rome and Avignon via Siena in the early years of the 14th century. So travel is something which is really intrinsic to the story of this exhibition. And then, of course, as I said before, how do we tell the story of this great city in through its movable art? Siena is really a city of three incredible cores in terms of its civic identity, and I want to talk about each of them just for a little bit. The first is the Campo. It's impossible, I think, to visit Siena without walking down the Campo. If you're lucky enough to go there for the Palio in the summer, for the horse race, which takes place in this very tight square. You really feel that there is nothing like this anywhere in the world. And still the contrade, or the neighborhoods of Siena, come together in this great competition in the year. But this is really an incredible space, and it is at the center of Siena's civic life. And just at the front of my slide, you see the great building which rises up and dominates it, and that's the Palazzo Pubblico. That's the town hall, the city hall of Siena, which today, as it was in the 14th century, is the center of civic life and government of the city and its region. Now, unlike in the 14th century, today's syndico and today's councillors don't actually have to live in the building, as we know they did during the 14th and 15th century. They lived in a little room at the top of the town hall, at the far left-hand side of my slide. And they had to not just live there, they slept there, they ate their meals together, and they took their deliberations together. And in the period that this exhibition covers, Siena was run in this tight way by the civic government of these men who were elected by lot every few months, who knew each other really well. And for about a period of 80 years, it was a really stable government. It was also a government which, although not democratic, was more representative than many of its time elsewhere in the world. So the other place that's central for thinking about Siena and for its art is the cathedral, that extraordinary complex of marble, of white, of green, and of pink marble on the top of one of the other hills of Siena. It's about 10 minutes walk from the Palazzo Comunale. And I'm showing you the outside of it, although it's changed a lot since the 14th century, and its facade was really, really redone in the 19th century. The facade of the cathedral was really a gallery of sculpture, of sculptural decorations by the Pisano father and son, and by their many by the many members of their workshop. And if you went up the steps of the cathedral, you walked into this unbelievable space that I'm showing you on my main image here, a space that at the center of it was a painting that we're going to talk about quite a lot in the rest of this lecture, or a painting ensemble, and that's Duccio's Great Maestà, the double-sided altarpiece that was brought up these stairs into this space in the very early years of the 14th century. The cathedral indeed is also opposite another of the great poles of Sienese identity and Sienese society, and that's the hospital of Santa Maria della Scala, which I'm showing you here in this image, in this panorama from the summer. It was until not very long ago, until really our lifetimes, was actually a working hospital. And this is the three sort of cores of the cathedral, the hospital, and the town hall are really central to Sienese life in the 14th century, and central to the commissioning of the works of art and the artists that we're now going to go on and look at. Paola mentioned Cimabue in her remarks at the beginning of this talk, and it's very interesting that the relationship of Siena and Florence was so close that in fact Sienese art was often confused with Florentine art, and that confusion really dates from the 16th century until the middle of the 19th century, and that's because of two important events. One is that in the middle years of the 16th century, Siena was finally taken into the control of the Florentines. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany, the first Grand Duke, Cosimo I, of course, was a member of the Medici family, and Siena became incorporated into the Medici and into the Tuscan state. And this meant that when the story of art begins to be told by Giorgio Vasari, himself a servant of the Grand Duke of Tuscany and of the Tuscan state in the 1550s and 1560s, he really subsumes Siena into the story of Florence, and then more gradually into the story of art. And in the 1850s, when Frederick Lord Leighton, the English author of the painting on the screen, when he is painting Cimabue's celebrated Madonna being taken through the streets of Florence, a painting that was bought up by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert immediately after it was exhibited, Leighton, like everyone else from the days of Vasari, confuses Cimabue's Madonna actually with that of Duccio. This painting that's represented here is Duccio's Rituali Madonna, commissioned for Florence, and indeed, but it's forgotten that it was the work of Duccio. It's thought to be the work of Cimabue. So the work of really understanding Sienese art in a wider context than that of Siena's history itself is something that really only begins in the middle years of the 19th century. And I think that's one of the reasons why it has been probably less appreciated than that of Florentines among general lovers of art. But what this exhibition really wants to argue is that it has an incredibly important role in the development of painting, not just in Tuscany, but more widely, because of the trade routes with which Siena is connected, and the way in which her 14th century artists also in themselves travel, not just their works, but them indeed themselves. But one of the problems always for exhibitions in physical form is that there are lots of works of art which are unable to travel, and you cannot have them. And that's because painters in the period that we're looking at here, the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, generally paint on walls as much as on movable surfaces. And one of the greatest works of European art, not just in Siena, is Ambrogio Lorenzetti's frescoes of good and bad governance. I'm showing you the fresco of good government painted in a tiny room at the top of the Palazzo Comunale in Siena, one of the greatest visualizations of government I think ever made, and something which it's impossible to show in the form of our exhibition. Another work which is impossible to bring anywhere outside the Palazzo Pubblico is Simone Martini's great Maestà, painted in the room next to Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Good and Bad Government in the 1310s, an incredible visualization of the court of heaven and indeed of the court of Siena. Very indebted to Duccio's Maestà, which we're going to look at, but something which is really you have to experience in the place that it's made. So exhibitions are always the art of the possible. And one of the great possibilities in this exhibition was the opportunity to bring together for the first time in hundreds of years, part of one of these seminal works of Western art. And that's Duccio's great Maestà for the Cathedral of Siena. The Maestà, as you know, and you can see from this reconstruction I'm showing you by the art historian John White, made in the end of the 1970s, the Maestà was dismembered in the 18th century. It was made for the high altar. We know that it was off the high altar by the early 16th century. And in the 18th century, it was divided in two. So the experience when you visit it today in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo is you see the front of the Maestà on one wall, you see large parts of the back of it on another, but many of the other panels from it have been sent and bought by collections around the world. We knew that we could never reconstruct the Maestà, but we worked out that we might have a fighting chance of re-bringing together the final part that Duccio made of that, and that's the back predella, the point at which he'd really refined his arts of narrative and of storytelling. So that was really one of the rationales for thinking of the exhibition, which is now called Siena, the Rise of Painting. That there was the opportunity in the collections of the National Gallery in London and of the Metropolitan Museum in New York to bring together a quite exceptional group of Sienese paintings, even though they've been scattered to collections around Europe, around North America, and around the world. The National Gallery in London is very fortunate to have 3 panels from Duccio's Maestà, one of which is the healing of the man born blind that I'm showing you on the screen. And the Metropolitan Museum has another exceptional group of Sienese paintings and also no Sienese objects of art. The most celebrated cited is the one which came into the museum most recently, and that's the so-called stock clay Madonna, which was bought by the Met in the early 2000s, in 2004, if I think I'm correct. And at that point, and indeed still, it is the most expensive painting that the Met has ever acquired. Although it is an object of tiny, tiny size, it is an incredible thing. What I think makes Duccio's work really, really exciting is that he is an artist who is very much exposed to Byzantine art. He sees it in Siena, he probably sees it elsewhere, but what you can see in the stock clay Madonna is Duccio's incredible innovation, as well as his respect for this long tradition of painting. And the innovation is in the element at the bottom of this tiny painted panel. It's the parapet that you see, the architectural element. Duccio is making clear that there is a space between the beholder and the sacred space. He's suggesting a sense of difference. He's also suggesting a sense of very human connection between Madonna and child, which is quite unusual at the time. You can see that the little Christ child is reaching out and pulling on his mother's veil. She is also holding him really between her body. She's caressing his clothes. There's a sense of connection between them, and his foot is also touching her hand. This human connection, the sense of the divinity also being human, is something which Duccio is one of the first to bring us. And it's one of the real tendencies that we'll see developing in this exhibition, in the pictures I want to talk about in the next few minutes. So this exhibition was a conjunction of collections of art and also of people. And I mentioned the people, but I just wanted to celebrate them here on the screen because I'm talking about this show, but this is the work of many, many individuals. And here are a couple of them. Stefan Wolahojian, who's the lead curator at the Met. He and I have worked together on many projects with Joanna Cannon over the space of a decade. It was an amazing moment when we came together for the installation of the exhibition. And this shows us in huge excitement as we had just after the back predella of the Maestà had been reassembled in a case for the first time, with conservators and curators bringing these works from all over America and the world. And then on the right is a younger colleague, Imogen Tedbury, who started working on a PhD with Joanna Cannon and myself in 2014. She's done a lot of the really essential research work for this exhibition because her thesis is about the collecting and the writing about Sienese art in Britain and America between about the period 1840 and 1920. So Imogen's work, which is partly published in the catalogue of the exhibition, was absolutely fundamental to creating the story between North America and Britain, which is one of the sub-stories, as it were, of the project and the publication that accompanies it. And I just want to take you through some of the displays that we're most proud of in the exhibition. I'm showing you the New York installation because obviously we haven't got that in London yet. It will look quite different in the spaces, but we're very lucky that we have the same objects essentially, bar one or two, being present in both venues. And with objects of such value and such fragility, as Paola said, it's also really significant that we don't have much distinction between the two parts of the exhibition. This is not an exhibition that will probably be repeated again. It's too complicated to do. And also these are things which you only move if you have a really good reason for doing so. An exhibition that isn't just going to be about showmanship, but it's going to be about scholarship and deep impression on viewers and visitors as well. So here you see the wonderful back predella of the Maestà together again for the first time since the late 18th century. And I just wanted to tell you about the story of this and how indeed it came together, because Duccio worked on the Maestà over a period of about 5 years. And we know that when it was processed into Siena Cathedral, it was brought through the streets of Siena with people playing instruments fence in front of behind it. It was a very heavy object, and it was commissioned for the cathedral by the town. So this combination of city and church, which is really important for the identity of Siena and for the creation of its art. The last part of this complicated object that Duccio worked on was the back predella. So it was also possible to potentially bring it together for this exhibition, but we were also interested in this because it was really the culmination of how Duccio had worked on his art. Now, one panel of this altarpiece, of this predella, and the predella is fascinating in terms of European painting because it became one of the key elements for artists to really tell a story which was theirs. It's the bottom level of an altarpiece. It's that which would be most visible when these were put high on an altar. The visibility is a term you have to use carefully in the 14th century, because we know that before the Council of Trent, people couldn't get into the middle parts, the central parts of a church. They were stopped there from the rood screen, and there were very careful rules about who was allowed in. It was really for the priests, but you would have seen it at least from a distance. And the priests who were privileged to be in front of the altar or behind the altar would have been able to experience the quality of these paintings at very, very close proximity. So we know that the back predella tells a story, and it tells a story of the life of Christ as he moves towards, in fact, his crucifixion. So we have scenes from the temptation of Christ, one which is lost, one which comes from the Opera del Duomo in Siena, then the temptation of Christ on the mountains from the Frick collection, just down the road from the Met, but a collection, of course, which very rarely lends, and at the moment is going through a great restoration, which made it possible for the picture to travel. The Calling of Peter and Andrew from the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the Wedding at Cana, again from Siena, from the Opera del Duomo, the Christ and the Woman of Samaria from the Thyssen collection, and then two panels from the National Gallery in London, the Healing of the Man Born Blind and the Transfiguration, and then finally the Raising of Lazarus from the Campbell Art Museum in Texas. We've all seen these pictures individually, but to see them together and to see the narrative connections that Duccio makes between them is really incredible. Something I've noticed particular, and you'll probably see because it's very obvious, is the way that Christ travels through these paintings, resplendent and very, very, very obvious to our eye in red and a great blue cloak. So you see him strikingly everywhere. He's your leitmotif that travels through the painting. So you really understand his story as it's depicted here. The paintings, of course, are also incredibly small, and Duccio has lavished care and attention on them. When you see them in the exhibition or the film we've made of the project, which I'll share an image of at the end, you can also see there are some incredible details which would have been almost invisible with the naked eye. And why does Duccio make them? For instance, in the second painting on the slide here, and that's the Temptation of the Christ from Siena, you'll see that there's a little doorway on the right-hand side. If you look inside this doorway, you can actually see architectural details of floor. And Duccio is thinking so carefully about space that even though this was invisible, it's important for him to put this in here. And these types of details are wonderful to be able to notice in the exhibition and the juxtaposition of the objects. One of the other challenges for this exhibition was how would we show the scale of many of these objects? A lot of the paintings that left Siena and have gone into collections throughout Tuscany and elsewhere are tiny, tiny fragments of painting. But we had an amazing opportunity to be able to safely bring a large painting into the context of this project too. And this was thanks to the generosity of the people of Arezzo, the congregation of the Church of the Pieve, and of the Archdiocese of Arezzo and Cortona. And that is a wonderful altarpiece by Pietro Lorenzetti, who is one of two brothers who were among Duccio's closest followers. We're pretty certain we worked in Duccio's workshop, though we have no documentary evidence for it. We have the evidence of the pictures, which is what really gives us a sense. And Pietro Lorenzetti, you're seeing here the polyptych he made for Bishop Tarlati, the bishop who ruled Arezzo in an ecclesiastical sense and also in a temporal one in the 1310s and the 1320s. This altarpiece has been in the Church of the Pieve in Arezzo since it was made there in the 1320. We had the remarkable opportunity to be able to study it and then safely to borrow it, because we've worked, Stefan Wooler-Hojan and Joanna Cannon and myself, for about 8 years with the conservation team in Arezzo who were working on this altarpiece. This is the Tarlati altarpiece as you see it together in its glory. It was very carefully and painstakingly restored by the two women you see in the center of this slide, one holding a photograph and one wearing a black and white jacket. The photograph they're holding is of their dear friend Lella, who was the third part of this team, who tragically died of cancer a year ago. This wonderful group of women who ran for many years a restoration studio called Ricerca in central Arezzo were entrusted with the restoration of the Tarlati polyptych about 10 years ago. The work was undertaken very, very carefully with collaboration from colleagues from the Opificio delle Pietre Dure in Florence, from George Basacca, previously one of the panel's conservators at the Met in New York, who now lives and works in Florence, and with ourselves. We weren't working on the paintings, obviously, but we were part of the team of scholars who they involved. And it's extraordinary that these objects, which are in their original thickness, they haven't been trimmed, they haven't been thinned, they haven't had any dangerous structural treatment since the 14th century. They were able to bring them back to their full glory, and also to have the unique opportunity for this object to be shown to audiences in New York and in London in the early part of next year. What Pietro Lorenzetti does, which is really interesting, from learning from what he's seen and worked on in Duccio's workshop, is he brings a greater monumentality. He is also an artist we know travels a lot outside Siena. He works extensively in Arezzo, as this polyptych demonstrates, and also in Assisi, where he's one of the major artists who's working in the frescoing of the basilica, together with his fellow Sienese, Simone Martini, also, of course, with Giotto and others. So the story of Sienese art is not just the story of a city. It's a story of an artistic style developed in a small place, which travelled and developed and which had a large impact on the development of European painting. The other, Pietro's brother, Ambrogio, is another very, very fascinating and important figure. If Pietro is very interested in monumentality, Ambrogio really is an extraordinary storyteller. You saw that in the fresco of Good Government I showed you. I think you can see this clearly in this marvelous panel of the Annunciation, which indeed was made for Siena, now belongs to the Pinacoteca Nazionale in Siena, and we're very lucky to have in the exhibition. I think even in my image, you can see that this is a work in which Pietro is playing very, very cleverly with perspective. Can you see the gold column which goes up through the center of the painting, which divides the Annunciate Virgin from Gabriel, who's bringing the news of the Annunciation, the fact that she is going to conceive a son who is going to be God on earth to her. This column, if you look at it properly, you will see that it is made absolutely of gold. Sienese painters, probably because they were exposed to the work of goldsmiths and metal workers, are extraordinarily skilled at thinking at the possibilities of gold and how it can be worked in ways which give dimension and indeed perspective. And in Ambrosio's Annunciation, you see one of the first examples of perspective played out in a painting in Europe. It's a work of unbelievable innovation. And yet, this innovation is quite difficult for visitors to see today because the gold really shuts people out and makes us think of something that is very, very old and antiquated and hasn't changed. And what is really stupendous about these painters is their ability to learn and also simultaneously their ability to innovate. And in the exhibition, we've been very lucky to show this, not just through completed panel paintings, but also through synopiae. Synopiae are the layer that are used in the preparation of frescoes. And it's been really wonderful in Tuscany over the last 60 or 70 years, as the synopiae or the underlayer often of frescoes have been revealed through conservation treatments. And one of the most emotional are those that Ambrogio Lorenzetti paints for a fresco cycle, again of the Annunciation, in a small church at Montisiepe in the centre of Tuscany. You see on the left of my screen his Synopia of the Annunciate Virgin. The Virgin looks staggered. She looks terrified by the news that she's been given, and she's clinging onto her chair, onto her throne, and onto her stand on which her book is, with incredible energy, but also real pathos and passion. And this ability to convey emotion is something which Sienese painters do very, very much pioneer. They do this partly because of what they're learning in the intense atmosphere of their own city, in the workshop and in the freewheel environment that Duccio is creating when he's working with so many artists on the Maestà, but also because of the objects which we know are coming into Tuscany at this point. And one of the important groups of objects are ivories, which cross the Alps and come into Italy. This is an object which we know was not in Siena, but it wasn't very far away. It was in Assisi, and it's one of the earliest documented ivories to come from France to Italy. The history of art normally tells us that the story is formed in Italy and then it goes north. Actually, it's much more complicated, and there's a lot of exchange. And these small scale objects seem to be very significant for Italian painters and how they think about representing the human figure, but also about the types of structures that they are making art out of. And one of the key structures that Italian artists use are these things called polyptychs. There are many sort of structured paintings, or triptychs, which is 3 parts. And of course, this is something they could have thought of themselves, but it's very interesting that there are a lot of small scale artworks being made in Paris in the late 13th and 14th century by artists working in ivory, such as this beautiful object I'm showing you here from Toledo, Ohio, currently on display in the Met. And when you think of the Italian polyptychs that you've seen, I think it's hard not to feel that artists saw these and thought about how they could create this idea in a very, very different medium. Traveling and transmission is, as I said, a very important part of the exhibition that's currently in New York. And no figure is probably more important for this in a European context than Simone Martini, who's St. John and the Evangelist from the Barber Institute in Birmingham in the UK. I'm showing you on the screen. Simone, we know, actually travels to Avignon. He lives in Avignon, which from the middle years of the 14th century is where the papal court is actually based. And Simone, like a number of great Italian thinkers, is in the city too. He had a very close connection and relationship with Petrarca. He illustrates Petrarch's own books. And these connections and conversations are the sorts of things we can almost think about when we see an object like this. This is the so-called Orsini polyptych. This is a series of panel paintings that were made for the Cardinal Napoleone Orsini, and they show again the story of the Passion of Christ, from his arrival in Jerusalem to his deposition. These tiny panels, which are double-sided, have not again been together for several hundreds of years. They're usually divided between museums in Antwerp, in Berlin, and in Paris. And we are thrilled to have been able to bring them together in the exhibition. I show you all of the parts of them on this slide here. It's hard to comprehend how different the experience of looking them in this very mobile way is here. We don't know exactly how they were put together, so we've tried to suggest in the design of the exhibition of how they might have been manipulated and moved in the hands of Napoleone Orsini, who was the person we know first owned them, and those who owned them subsequently too. By the 15th century, we know these paintings were in Dijon, in northern France, at Champnol, which was a very important monastic foundation outside the city of Dijon. They were seen by all sorts of painters there. And the story of the Orsini polyptych becomes not just the story of Siena, but indeed the story of French art, and by other transmission too, that of art in Bohemia, in what's now the Czech Republic, and also indeed even as far as London, in a great object called the Wilton diptych, which is now one of the great stars of the National Gallery in London. But I wanted to end by just concentrating on one object, which I think shows how, in the 50 years that this exhibition looked at, how painting had developed, how it had been possible to have so many possibilities in this small city. And that's the object which you can see at the center of my screen from its installation in New York. This is a painting also by Simone Martini. It's the presentation of Christ in the temple. And since the late 18th century, it has belonged to the city of Liverpool in the north of England. It's one of the great treasures of the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. It never has travelled outside its city before. And for me, and I think for many others, this exhibition is really showing this to be one of the absolute standout paintings, not just of Siena, but of Western art. And I wanted to explain in a few words why. In this painting, you see three figures set against a golden background. You see the Virgin Mary. We know it's her because she's wearing blue, and she is reading a book. There are two other figures with her. Can you see there is an older man in the background? And this is Joseph, her spouse. He has got his arm round a younger man, and this is Christ as a teenager. This is, if you remember the story from the Gospel, that Christ is said to have gone with his parents to the temple in Jerusalem. And they lose sight of him. They do not know where he is. They are absolutely beside themselves with worry. As a mother of a 14-year-old boy who does walk around a city safely, but I have a mobile phone to be able to track him. And this is certainly not something which was open to Joseph and to the Virgin Mary in the early years of Christ's life. What Simone, I think, so marvelously does here is convey the sense of Christ as being somebody who is really human, which is something which is often hard to gain from the way in which he's represented and indeed from the stories in the Gospel. This is Christ as someone who is very, very certain of what he has to do. You might remember when his parents say, "What have you done? Where have you been?" He says, "Oh, I was in my Father's house," i.e. the temple. And that's a very clear explanation. But you can also see from Mary and from Joseph's expressions in this panel how incredibly worried and how nervous they were and how thrilled they are have to have him back again. I think you can also possibly see, and this is not just, I think, 21st century reading into it, a sense of the truculence of the teenage Christ as well. He's folding his arms because of the certainty of what he believes and what he's doing, but also of the fact that he's really quite cross about being questioned in this way by his parents. So this is a painting which is of one moment and one story, but I think it's also very, very timeless too. And the possibilities of how painting has been evolving in the 50 years, less than that, since the creation of Duccio's Maestà to the making of this work, which is also one of the first paintings in Western art that is signed by its maker. The other, of course, is Duccio's Great Maestà. And you might be able to see at the bottom of my image that in this painting, which is still in its integral frame, you can see Simone of Siena painted this in 1342. So he identifies himself, but he also is telling this great story more wonderfully and more complicated than many artists before or since him have. And what is incredible about an exhibition like this is that if you go to Liverpool, you can see Simone's painting and enjoy it. Many people do. It's probably the greatest work of art in Northern England, but it's very unusual to be able to see these objects together. And that's why it's worth doing projects like this, because hopefully we all begin to think and look at the Sienese paintings that we know, or even those that we didn't know before, in a different light because of projects such as this. So I'm delighted to have the chance to share this exhibition with you this evening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I look forward to any questions or observations you might have. And thank you for being with me to go back to the art of 14th century Siena in November 2024, and to be able to time travel ourselves, not just in the presentation, but between Ireland, Italy, and all sorts of parts of North America. Thank you.
Caroline, thank you so much for giving us this incredible story of some of the favorite works of art that you decided to share with us tonight. So my impression is that the seed of this possibility of this exhibition was planted long ago. I think at the time you were still the curator at the National Gallery in London.
Right. I mean, so actually, even before that, so I became a curator at the National Gallery in London in 2012. And before that, Joanna Cannon, Stefan Wooler-Hodgson, and I were working on a very different project. We were working together on a project about a friar who was a painter. And whose major works are divided between the Courtauld Institute in London and the Fogg Art Museum in Harvard and Cambridge, Massachusetts. And at that point, we began to think about whether it might be possible to collaborate on another project. And we started talking about the idea of Siena. But we had no idea at that sense that it would happen because I was not yet at the National Gallery. Stefan was not yet at the Metropolitan Museum. But it was an idea that the three of us were really keen to think about together because it's been a subject of Joanna Cannon's research for very, very, very many years.
Incredible. And to have the incredible way to now place these objects together and have them converse with each other. That must have been a really special feeling as you walked maybe through the rooms of the exhibition before it opened to public.
It's always wonderful when you have a chance to do that. And when you work on a project like this, the most fun part is always when the objects come together. I mean, it's really extraordinary. You notice and see so many things, and it's very moving. But the most moving moment of all is when you first see people walking through the exhibition and enjoying it, because then you think, actually, this really was, there was a point in doing this, not just for scholars, but really the point of doing exhibitions is so that we will all not just enjoy them, but we will learn something as well too.
Yes. I think also the restoration of some of these works in Arezzo, also the cities like Montesiepi, if there was not for this collaboration, they probably would have never been brought to Restoration Studio and polished up and made so beautiful again.
Well, we've been really, really lucky on this project to be able to work with such incredible restorers and conservators in Italy and beyond. And every time when we asked for a work of art of loan, we only asked if the conservator said, yes, we think this could travel, this would be okay. So that's one of the reasons it took so long, because the conversations with the conservators in some cases started many, many years ago as well. And it was wonderful to follow the restoration of the Tarlati altarpiece, which actually was funded by Friends of Florence and by Art Angels of Arezzo, a project that started about 10 years ago, to be able to visit the studio many times and many years with the restorers and to look at them. And a collaboration which we're still ongoing through this project is a major one with the Opera delle Pietre Dure in Florence. We have been able to work together between the Opificio, the Opera del Duomo in Siena, the National Gallery and the Metropolitan Museum to undertake a full infrared study, a technical study of the panels for the Maestà that have remained in Siena for the first time. And this material will be published in the following years. We haven't completed the project yet, but we've been able to take full infrared reflectograms of the individual Maestà panels. And what's interesting about infrared is that shows you the drawing that you can't see with the naked eye underneath the surface of the painting, but it also shows you how the painter worked. And it can begin to make you understand how an object like the Maestà, which was made by many different people, with the involvement of many people in Duccio's workshop, to try and identify some of those individual hands. And since we're pretty certain that among those were the Lorenzetti brothers and Simone Martini, with the paintings we have by them that are signed by them and comparing with their infrareds to see if there are technical grounds on which we can advance the attribution of parts of the Maestà as well. So exhibitions at their best don't just end with the project. They have a life and a continuation in all sorts of forms.
Yes, yes. Caroline, you might see there are different comments and words of thanks coming in the chat. I wanted to say thank you for me personally. This brought me back to Siena. I was studying at the University of Siena for my graduate degree, my second graduate degree, and I was able to go and visit the museums that you mentioned with my lovely group of colleagues. We're actually around the world. And what I found in many ways, I was thinking that Renaissance never really reached the city of Siena
Mm,
because all of the exhibitions that we saw, they were actually absolutely beautiful in the Pinacoteca, in the hospital of Santa Maria della
mm.
Scala, and of course the main sponsor would have been Monte dei Paschi, the famous
Yes.
Sienese bank. And I was always surprised that they never even bothered to, this is in 2010, they never bothered to translate the panels in English.
Mm,
They were
mm,
only in Italian. So in a
mm,
way,
mm.
Siena is really hard to reach. You cannot really take a highway and get there. Even in the
Yes.
train, they made it really difficult. So in a way, you brought Siena to the world by doing this exhibition.
Well, I hope that more people go to Siena as a result of this exhibition. Siena is a very, very special place, as you say, Paola. And one of the special features of it is it isn't easy to get to. And that's partly, I think, because of being up, the relationship with Florence is really complicated. And many Sienese people are still, really don't like the Florentines very much. And it's very that rivalry is still very, very, very prevalent. But it did mean, I mean, the dominance of Florence did mean that, Siena didn't have connections, and that has still been played out in the government of Tuscany. A lot of Sienese people would say. But for as a visitor, it's amazing to go to the city because, you step off the bus, which is probably the best way of getting there rather than the train, and suddenly suddenly you're in this city, which obviously has changed and evolved, but it still has its medieval walls. It still feels when you walk in it like you're in medieval skyscrapers because it's really tall and the buildings go up high, but not to a very, very high height. And you have such an identity of the hills of the city, the way it feels to walk around it, and the great red of the brick of the city too. But it is becoming a city that now is open to many more foreigners. It's one of the best places to learn Italian, actually. The university there, and it's also the Pinacoteca in Siena has become an autonomous museum in the Italian state system, and they are making big changes there as a result. So if you have been to Siena and thought it was quite sleepy, there are changes afoot at the Pinacoteca and good ones. They're already really improving the interpretation, the lighting, and the displays.
Yes, so much to be done. Thinking about the city and how sleepy it was in 2010 when I was there after I graduated. I went to the student office and I said I would love to have my diploma, my degree ready. And they said it will take some time. It will be on parchment. You will have to go and pay in Monte dei Paschi. And then they said, and where will you be in 3 years from now? And I said, I have no idea. I was just studying in Florence, and they said, because it will be ready in 3 years of
My
your degree.
goodness.
So, it was like, oh, I went in and I gave my gold coins, in Monte dei Paschi. I thought, oh my goodness, nothing's really changed since 1200s when the university was there. Caroline, there's so many. If you want to just take a quick look at the chat, mostly to see all the words of praise coming your
Oh,
way.
thank you.
I just see some of the questions is when
Mm.
will the exhibition be in London? It will be starting in March
It
in
will
the
be
National.
from March until June. I think it's the 8th of March to the 22nd of June, but the details are on the National Gallery of London's website. So yeah, please look at that. I see there's a question about gold. Oh my goodness, I mean, we'd be here for eternity, because gold is one of the really interesting features that stays in Sienese painting through the 15th century as well too. And it seems to be because of perhaps a veneration for the art of Duccio and his contemporaries, but also a sense of representing divinity. And yes, it does emphasize spiritual scenes, but it's interesting that Sienese artists do stick with gold backgrounds for longer. Than many other artists do. And it seems to be partly because of the spiritual nature, but also because of their skill in being able to work with gold and to be able to make it seem three-dimensional when you look at it in a way that other artists don't seem to do as much. Gold has so many possibilities when you light it with candles or when you think of strong sources of light being upon it. So it's a very good question. There is another remark I saw about the Council of Trent. And again, that's really complicated. And there are other people on this call who know far more about the changes that happened to Italian churches as a result of religious reform than I do. But essentially, what's important to say is in the 14th century, there would be a screen that would divide lay people's access to the church. They would only have access to some of it. And there would also be generally divisions about places where men and women could go in churches as well, though that's, not always so set. And people can see objects on the altar through the screen. These objects were not processed out of the church. The complicated thing about Duccio's Maestà is that there's this procession that is documented of it coming into the church, but then it doesn't leave the church. It stays in the church until it's taken off the altar. But people know it's there, and they're very proud of it. And part of when you go into the church is the knowledge that these objects are there, even if you can't see them. And are there any drawings in the show? The Sinopia that I showed you, yes, they're in the exhibition from Montesiepe, and that's wonderful. And one question is, why is this exhibition not in Italy? Well, there have been many important exhibitions of Sienese art in Italy. Lastly, there was a great show about Ambrogio Lorenzetti in Siena in 2018. There was an incredible Duccio show in Siena in 2003, 2004, when they made these amazing discoveries of frescoes underneath the crypt of the cathedral. So, but there is always a permanent exhibition of Sienese art in Siena, in the Pinacoteca, and also in the Opera del Duomo. So I suppose that's why. But this exhibition there's never been an exhibition of this scale outside Italy of Sienese art, and in fact, so it's important, I think, for Siena that it happened outside of the city and outside of the country. And someone else has said, can't wait to visit Siena again. Arriving on the bus in rain was magical. Yes, it is. Thank you so much for all your questions and for your attention.
Thank you, Caroline. I would just say, for those of you who want to experience Simone Martini still in the original setting, when you're in Florence next, let's bring it back to Florence.
Indeed.
Right? The Church of Santa Trinita has a beautiful Bartolini Salimbeni chapel that still has its original gate and Simone Martini altarpiece just sitting there. It's completely free to enter, and you can come any day of the week. So we are still privileged enough to have these places available to us to see it where the creators intended them to be. So incredible. Caroline,
Indeed.
thank you.
Not at all. Thank you all. And have a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Wonderful to join you. And thank you, Paola, for bringing us together. Thank you.